And thank you. And so I'll start now. Hello to everyone joining. My name is Robbie Lansborough. I'm a consultant at Seafood Scotland, and I'm chairing today's webinar. So welcome. It's I think a hotly anticipated webinar on export health certification changes, which are coming in from the 15th of January 2022. I think we've got what seems like a very big turnout, which is good news in a sense. No doubt reflects the sort of fairly big impact of the changes coming, but also the importance of hearing from experts on these upcoming changes. I think it's fair to say that there have been some challenges on getting clarity and definitive answers on certain definitions and interpretations, and so hopefully today we can provide as many answers as there are questions. That's the ambition. We'll see what we can do. That's all I want to say really as an introduction. I will just about to bring in Steve Galloway here, but some housekeeping before I do, which I think is more important, particularly as we have a big turnout, is well, as you may know, but if you don't, we are recording this session, so you should be notified about that. If you're not speaking, please stay muted. And if you want to ask questions, and there will be a Q&A session a bit later after the presentation, if you can use the chat bar to post questions or put your virtual hand up, then that would be the best way to do it, and I'll be monitoring all of that throughout. So yes, we've got a presentation and then we've got a Q&A session, so that will be sort of the main parts of the webinar. If I can pass on to Steve from here, and then we can go into the presentation. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Robbie. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Galloway, like Robbie and Alistair on the call today. We're consultants to Seafood Scotland, assisting with Brexit-related issues. Just to add very briefly, by way of introduction, we thought that this would be a helpful webinar now that we have some idea of some of the answers to some of the questions that we've been asking. Not only to get clarity from DEFRA in terms of the new requirements, but also to gather some people representing other organisations at different stages in the supply chain to the EU for seafood, to discuss and explain the different implications and how these changes are going to affect companies in the industry at these different stages of the chain. As we know, the changes affect not only the EHCs themselves, but also may impact on certification of premises, etc. So we're delighted to be joined today by Arabella White, representing the Food Centre Scotland at the hubs, and Daniel Hopwood, who is the Senior Environmental Health Officer at Highland Council, to talk about the process from their perspective, as well as Joe Triscott at Marine Scotland. So thank you very much. And also, of course, Dr. Richard Watson from DEFRA, who has kindly offered to present to us today and explain the changes and the requirements. So I'm going to at this point hand over to Richard, who will take us through a presentation, after which, as Robbie says, we'll be able to discuss the content of that with Richard and the Q&A panel. So I'll hand over to you, Richard. Many thanks.
No problems at all. There should be a presentation with this one. I don't know if it's possible to bring that up. Brilliant. Oh, thank you very much. I would also just at this point say thanks to Hannah Thompson from Seafish as well, who helped to pull this presentation together. We have shamelessly plagiarized parts of her presentation as well. So I think I'd like to describe this as a joint one. Brilliant. Okay, so next slide, please. Just by way of introduction, my name is Richard Watson. I'm head of policy at DEFRA. My remit covers fish exports as well as other areas, for example, digital certification to the EU as well. So it's quite a broad remit. What I want to try and do today is talk about the new animal health legislation. This legislation came in a little while back, but it was deferred until the 15th of January, which means that up until the 15th of January, the existing certificates can be used. After the 15th of January, there will be a new requirement for the updated EHCs to be used. It is worth just highlighting that there will be further updates to these certificates. These are about to be published by the Commission. There aren't many changes within them. They're largely just clarifications, but it is just to flag that there will be some new certificates coming out in the next few months, but we'll tell you more about those when they come in, but that's nothing too much to worry about in that case. The big changes will occur on the 15th of January. Okay, so if we could have the next slide, please. So what's changed? And if we go on to the next one, we'll be able to see the big changes. So currently we have two EHCs, 8270 and also 8249. And they are broadly split into fishery products and also live bivalve mollusks. That continues largely into the new certificates. I think there's a slight change on this one if we go on to the next one. There should be an arrow. There we are. So what we'll see is that some shellfish actually will now live within the live bivalve mollusks, and scallops are an example of that. So broadly speaking, anything that is a LBM, a live bivalve mollusk, echinoderms, tunicates, gastropods and their products will now sit within 8364. Live fish, live crustaceans, so crabs, lobsters, for human consumption will sit in 8361. It's worth highlighting that I'm not going to be talking about movements of live fish in this presentation. So fish, ornamental fish, for example, or fish for restocking purposes. This is just purely seafood products that are intended for human consumption. It's also worthwhile noticing that there is a new EHC 8461, which allows the re-export of animal products back into the EU or NI. The use of the word NI is important here. When I talk about the EU, I'm generally talking about NI as well, Northern Ireland, because the regulations that apply to Northern Ireland currently are the same as they are for the EU. It doesn't apply, however, for anybody who's moving goods into Northern Ireland under the existing STANMI scheme. If so, that would be for people who are moving products into supermarkets, for example, where certification isn't needed. I'm also not going to be talking today about any of the certification, for example, catch certificates. I'm really going to try and focus just on export health certificates. So what we're going to do is look at the two new ones, 8364 and 8361, and try and tell you a little bit more about what are the key changes within there. So next slide, please. So how are these new EHCs different? And next one, please. So the key thing that you will find in terms of changes is when an OV will be needed, an official veterinarian. So this is the change that applies to the fishery products certificate 8361. So where you see a species that is listed in the EU legislation and it is aquaculture origin or hand gathered from the wild, and if the species is intended for further processing in the EU, then an OV will now be required to sign that certificate instead of a local authority officer, an FCCO. So that is the biggest change. So when you are now certifying your products, what you will need to do is make sure that you consider what you are moving, where it has come from, and also what is the intended destination, what is the known destination of this. So if it is intended for further processing, and I'll come into what that means in a minute, it will need an OB. So just go on to the next one. So in terms of what's changing for the live bivalve mollusks, slightly different in this case. So again, we're looking for species that are listed in the legislation. Again, we're looking for products that are of aquaculture origin or hand gathered from the wild. It's worth just emphasizing here that aquaculture refers to anything that there is ownership of those products. So if you are growing mussels, for example, in an open marine environment, and they are your mussels, that is an aquaculture establishment. If you are going out into the marine environment, gathering those mussels from the wild and landing them on a vessel, that is not aquaculture. So they're listed in legislation. They're of aquaculture origin. So those two would need an OV, or if they are listed of aquaculture origin and they are dead and they're intended for further processing, so the products of LBMs, they will also need an OV to sign. So again, changes to the scenarios, and we can give some examples of the types of species that would be included, and I think they're on the next slide. So if you click on to the next one. We'll come to further processing first. So further processing, we now have had confirmation from the Commission that further processing means anything that affects the anatomical wholeness of that organism. So if we're looking at fish, for example, we would be looking at anything that could be deheading, gutting, filleting, anything that alters the anatomical structure and will produce waste. Doesn't include wrapping and packing. You could also apply a similar scenario to shellfish as well. So anything that alters the anatomical structure of that shellfish. Next slide, please. So the listed species, this is contained in Regulation 2018/1882. And there are some particularly important species just to highlight. Named species include salmon and trout, for example, rainbow trout or Atlantic salmon, all decapod crustaceans and European flat oysters. They also mention vector species within here. These are species that can carry diseases, and they are also brought within the legislation. So blue mussels, for example, are considered a vector species as well. So what this means is that if you are a salmon exporter, you will almost certainly be covered by these legislation if you are moving salmon from a aquaculture site into the EU for further processing. It also means that if you are moving sort of blue mussels, unless it comes from the wild and is landed onto a vessel, it will almost certainly need an OV to sign that EHC. So there are sort of changes that you need to be aware of, and just check with the legislation again to make sure what species are covered, and if you need to get an OV from that point of view. So next slide, please. So in terms of vector species, the vector species, if they are considered a vector when they live in proximity to a listed species. So if we look at the blue mussels, for example, They are considered a vector because they are come in contact with decapod crustaceans. So as a result, they're considered a vector species. Where they are not in close proximity, that wouldn't be considered a vector. Primarily one we need to think about will be LBMs. So next slide. Are there any exemptions? If your fish is not, or shellfish is not listed or not considered a vector, it falls outside of the scope of this regulations and can still be signed by an FCCO. Wild fish or bivalve mollusks landed by a fishing vessel. So if you are landing, let's say, crabs, lobster, if you are landing plaice, whatever else it happens to be, then they will not be covered. Fish and shellfish products are ready for direct human consumption. And gastropod tunicates are ectoderm species exported dead or alive. So there's some exemptions here. Next slide. So what else is new? This is a further important element, the clinical inspection. It's worth stressing that not all species where they're listed will require a clinical inspection. And again, this only applies where a species is listed. Where will this primarily impact? It primarily impacts on eviscerated fish. So listed eviscerated fish going for further processing. So if you are sending whole salmon from aquaculture to the EU, first of all, it will require an OV to sign off your export health certificate. It will also require an OV to carry out a clinical inspection 72 hours before loading. That OV signing off the certificate and the OV doing the clinical inspection do not have to be the same person. There is a attestation available in the hub guidance to enable the information from the OV carrying out the clinical inspection to certify that that work has been done. It is worth also just specifying at this point that the certificate does not say what is required in a clinical inspection. This will be based on the judgment of the OV and the nature of the species that is being carried out. So that is something for the OV to define. It's also worth identifying that clinical inspections are also required for LBM and crustacean species packaged and labeled for human consumption if they are able to survive as living animals, they're not packaged for retail sale, or they're not intended for further processing without temporary storage. It's worthwhile, again, checking your destinations and the conditions in which those animals are being moved. Next slide, please. There's also a new requirement for veterinary oversight of aquaculture establishments. So again, this only applies where an OV is required to be signing the certificates. So again, if we take our example of salmon being moved to the EU for further processing, if an OV is needed to be signed in this case, which it would be, it will also need veterinary oversight of the aquaculture establishments. Now, most establishments are already have oversight through FHIs and probably also through veterinary arrangements. A vet will be required to be there to give that oversight. It does not mean that a vet needs to be there all the time, nor does it mean that a vet has to be there at the point of export. It just means to say that a vet has to have oversight of that aquaculture establishments to certify the health status. that vet can rely upon previous surveillance by the fish health inspectors and previous records of veterinary visits as supporting evidence, but a vet still needs to sign this element off. Again, there is an attestation that can be used to support this oversight, and that again is in the hub guidance to help the OV understand this has been undertaken. The certificate does not specify the frequency of the veterinary visits. The veterinary visits will be, or the frequency will be a clinical decision based upon the status of the site. So if there are particular disease concerns within a site, then you might find that the frequency of that oversight will be much higher than something with a very good low risk disease status. It's also worth saying as well that this would include open marine environments. We're not just talking here about salmon pens, for example. So this could be mussel beds in an open marine environment. And this is a vet that would need to carry this out. It doesn't need to be an OV. Okay, next slide, please. So labelling requirements, what has changed? There are requirements now for listing the number of live animals within a consignment. We have had it confirmed from the Commission now that an estimated number of those animals can be used. It does not have to be a count of every single animal. However, if there are only half a dozen lobsters, for example, in a consignment, we would expect that that figure would be accurate. Estimated numbers primarily relate to if you're, for example, moving 1 ton bags of mussels, that you would not be expected to count every single LBM in that bag. We would suggest that the number is calculated based on the weight of the animals, total weight of the animals against the average weight per animal, and that will be accepted. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the certificates, what we again would always suggest that you do, if you have specific concerns, contact your BCP. We recognise that all BCPs sometimes have slightly different interpretations of the regulations. So if you have any concerns, please talk to them and confirm any certification requirements of your export. We will also be updating the notes for guidance associated with these certificates, and we're expecting those to go out very quickly. We have been receiving final bits of information from the Commission, and we're just going through the final clearance processes at the moment. We hope to get these out published very soon, so certifiers will be able to have a look at this. However, the guidance that we've already issued provides much of this information. Where the information has been a little bit trickier has been actually understanding what further processing means. So those are the key updates that we'll be seeing. And again, happy to take any questions, because I think that is the last slide.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was, I think, really helpful. Thanks also to Hannah for obviously helping with that, put together that presentation. So I think probably now is the time for opening it out to a question and answer session. As I said, using either the chat bar or the or putting your hand up, and we'll put questions to Richard and the rest of the panel. I just want to check, I can go to Alistair and Steve perhaps. I'm seeing nothing on the chat panel, but I'm not sure if that's, oh, sorry, there's a question that's come up. So I can't see it properly. I just thought I might be missing things. There is a question from Angela Ashby. If there are fish farms with BKD orders in place, can these still be certified under the new EHC?
Yes, absolutely. That's a good point, and thank you for raising that one. That's one of the reasons why we're updating the certificates at the moment. The position is, if you are moving, this applies to uneviscerated fish that are susceptible to BKD, bacterial kidney disease, primarily salmon. So most of the EU is not a problem, and most of the UK is not a problem. The island of Ireland, however, has disease-free status. If you are moving fish into the Republic of Ireland through Northern Ireland, Dara have confirmed they're happy for this to occur. It will need to be within a sealed lorry, and it will need to be moved to a disease control establishment for processing that fish. So it will need to be an approved establishment. If you wish to move uneviscerated salmon into Northern Ireland, you will have to follow the same procedure, but it will need to be, again, to an approved disease control establishment in Northern Ireland. To the best of my knowledge, there aren't any at the moment. So if that is something that you wish to do, you will need to ensure that the receiving site is an approved disease establishment, and that will need to go through the competent authorities within Northern Ireland. So there isn't a ban at all. We just need to make sure that for biosecurity reasons that the salmon are treated. This does, as I say, does not apply to uneviscerated salmon or salmon fillets.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Richard. Hopefully that answers your question, Angela. Let us know if not, and we can pursue that further. The next question I've got in the chat bar is from Anthony Brogan, I think, that's what I saw. What are the likely economic implications of this certification regime? Will it lead to export delays and loss of revenue for cross-border exports on the island of Ireland? I don't know who's best placed to answer that.
In terms of the big changes, I think for the majority of species, the changes will be relatively minimal. So if you're looking at movements of crabs, prawns, for example, it will largely be business as usual in terms of certification. Where you are looking at things like salmon, we've worked quite closely with Scottish Salmon to work through this, and a lot of the certification already is OV based in that scenario. So we don't expect there to be any major changes. Equally, a lot of the salmon farms are already under veterinary supervision. So one of the things that we've sort of said is if the salmon farm is been inspected regularly by a vet, as long as there is no conflict of interest with that vet, the vet can provide the attestations to the OV to enable the certification. So we are working with industry, working with the Scottish Government as well to make sure that the impact of these is minimised. We'd also highlight as well that we are working to increase the number of OVs, and that has grown considerably. I think it was something like less than 600 when we started off pre-Brexit. We're now up to just shy of 2,000. There is also funding available to help OVs get the qualifications they need. So that's the PX and the EX qualifications. So again, we would sort of encourage OVs to, or vets considering to become an OV, to work through that. In terms of the relative costing, the costing for EHC certification by local authorities compared to OVs is not necessarily straightforward. We know that some local authorities do subsidise their EHCs, so their costs are quite a bit lower, but generally those costs are rising because they're quite heavily subsidised. And indeed, in a lot of the research that we've been doing recently, the cost for local authorities is quite often quite similar to OVs, but it will depend where you are. And for example, if you're wanting out of hours services and so on, because that will vary a little bit. Hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yes, hopefully it was Anthony that asked that question. Hopefully that sort that. Do let us know if that's if you need more information on that. The next question on the chat is from Connie McCaskill, and she said, as an exporter of live prawns, exclusively getting our certificates from our local council EHO, are we now required to find an OV? And she said she's not sure if we have one. They have one locally.
I'll jump in there.
I don't know if I'll save you some catch your breath, Richard. You want to come in?
Yeah, I would assume that these are being landed by a fishing vessel, and in that case, they can continue to be signed by the EHO. Species landed by a fishing vessel are one of the categories which are exempt from OV certification.
Yeah. So wild, landed by fishing vessel, you should be fine.
Great stuff. Thank you for the clarity. Next is Colin Thwaites. Said, I've read in the guidance that all fish that is being exported to the EU for further processing must now be labelled for further processing in the EU. Can you confirm this is a requirement? And for frozen products, often the supplier doesn't know if the product is headed for the EU, UK, or overseas at the time of packing. So that's what he's giving the context there. So
yeah, I think the position that we are working with at the moment is that if you have a product that you know will be going for further processing, which will alter the anatomical structure of that fish, then it should be identified as intended for further processing. If you have a product that is ready for direct human consumption, and let's say, for example, is going into a fish market, and that could equally end up on a fishmonger's slab, or it, so it is, to all intents and purposes, ready for human consumption, then we're recommending that it can still be signed for by an FCCO, but that product must be ready for direct human consumption. So uneviscerated fish, for example, would not fall under that category. If you have any concerns on this, then we would recommend sort of say, okay, go down the OV route, and OV certification is perhaps better, but that is the position that we're taking, that if it is ready for human consumption, direct human consumption, and goes, for example, to a fish market, then it can be continue to be signed by an FCCO. But obviously, if we're talking about an LBM, for example, then that would need an OV, because that's slightly different. So we need to be careful which species we're talking about here. I think if the products are frozen and are likely to, and it is highly likely that those frozen products will then be made into pies or something else like that, then I think it is more likely that you are going to be needing to get an OV to sign.
Thanks very much, Richard. Hopefully that helps.
When I say pies, fish pies, I should say. Not so. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully that was picked up. Thank you very much, Richard. Hopefully
yes.
Colin, if anyone else wants
I think there is a degree of judgment that you would need to make here, and that would we would expect the OV as well, or the certifying officer, to make that clinical judgment. If it is clearly destined for a processing factory, then we would expect the certifying officer to sort of say, this is for further processing, an OV will need to sign this. Equally, if there's a product that clearly is going for further processing, so uneviscerated fish, for example, or fish that is going for another purpose, again, that there needs to be some judgment within here.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Richard. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that and just make sure the panel's
Hi,
Colin.
this is Colin. I asked the question.
Yep. Hi, Colin. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. My question. My interpretation is it is going for further processing. All these products that I move do need further processing almost universally. But my point is, when that product is packed and put into the cold store and labeled, you don't know whether the destination is the EU or overseas. So obviously, if I put a label on saying that this is destined for the EU and then I send it to Vietnam, they're not going to want that label in Vietnam. So my question, I think I need an OV. I don't have any argument with that. But this is obviously going to cause quite a lot of complexity because I may have to retrospectively rework the labeling once I know where the destination is. And that's quite a major change from where we are at the moment.
I think it's also considering how your labeling goes as well. My understanding is that can be applied to the boxes that go on the outside. But yes, if you are moving it to the EU, then it must be identified as such. Yeah. Joe, I don't know if you were about to come in there. You look like you're going to say something.
No, I was going to say, Colin, is it a case that it's still you exporting directly and you've already stored the product, or is it going to someone else who's then doing the exporting, and could they potentially do the labeling?
I mean, the answer to that is it's being held in a cold store, and anyone can do the labeling. The cold store can do the labeling, but anytime you're having to rework, it's going to cost you money and complexity. So I'm just trying to work out, do I just have to accept this is going to be a more costly process because I've got to put a new label on, often, at late doors before it's exported.
Yeah, the issue is the labelling requirements set out in EU legislation for any products entering the EU need to have that label if it's either for further processing or human consumption. And there's no way around that requirement. Unfortunately, it's an EU requirement. So unfortunately, I think it's just kind of the planning aspect of it may need slight review for your business potentially.
And I think this is potentially something we could try and pick up and sort of look at. We can look at your sort of journey map and sort of see how it is. But I would agree with Joe. Ultimately, we need to make sure that labelling is accurate on here, because it will it will result in rejection at the BCP without it.
Okay, that's what I thought you'd say, but I was just looking for clarification. Thank you.
Yep.
And thanks, Stuart. So, Colin, if happy to get in touch direct to have any follow-up on that, so you can just see what we can do to help on that and get further sort of clarity. So that's the case for everyone, obviously. The next question we have is, do we need to include the destination client's food approval number on the new EHC?
I will have to check this one. I don't think so. I will double check, but I don't think so.
I'm looking at a copy of the template here, Richard, and it does mention registration / approval number for the place of destination.
Right. Yeah.
Or maybe an ID is required.
Yeah.
So it's speak with your known destination. In the same way that a processor here will have an approval number from their local authority, there'll be an equivalent within the EU member state as well.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Richard. Hopefully that answers that question, but let us know if not. The next question is, how will this new EHC affect Winkle exports?
Periwinkles will be covered by this, and it depends again how they're landed. So if they're hand gathered from the wild, then Joe.
Yeah, no, sorry. I think speaking about periwinkles here, which are gastropods, in which case they do not need OV certification for that shell for certificate. It is only live bivalve or LBMs or bivalve mollusks which require OV certification. The gastropods can continue to be certified by the FCCO.
Yeah.
Thank you. hopefully that's fine. And Martin, again, please come back if you need any more information. Gillian, we've been told there would be labeling requirements for salmon going into the EU if for further processing or human consumption. Is this true? And if so, what is the statement?
Yes, I mean there is labeling requirements. I think we've sort of mentioned that a little bit already. So yes, the wording will be is contained in the certificate. They will need to make sure that the labeling is appropriate to that.
I believe the wording has been put into the chat bar by Hannah as well,
Yep.
further down for reference.
That's helpful. Thank you. Thanks Hannah, and thanks Joe and Richard. Got a question from Ina Kelly. I am very new to the seafood industry and very confused by all of this. Can links be provided to guidance that I could read, and links with not a lot of jargon? I don't know if any of you can promise that, but that's a very valid question.
Yeah, I mean, we will be putting up guidance, so please use that. And I would also sort of obviously make reference to sort of bodies like Seafood Scotland and Seafish, sorry, to sort of make use of them, and they will also be helping out as well.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, and absolutely. From Seafood Scotland perspective, we can certainly try and interpret and clarify it as best we can. Next question is from Jack Brown. Does the new EHC 8361 for composite fish products (fish cakes)?
Yeah, there are separate certificates for composite products, so you would probably need to look at those. Again, it depends what the composition of those products actually are. Joe, I don't know if you can remember the top of your head which one the composite ones is.
not the number off the top of my head, Richard. No. And I believe it involves the percentage content of product in the fish cake as well. Yeah. So we could maybe try and pick that one up and get back if Robbie can kind of pass on the details at the end. We can try and look into that.
Composites are a tricky area. It's not straightforward.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Richard. Yeah. Well, with all of this, being no doubt, we will follow up where things aren't answered fully. So don't worry about that. So back to Colin. Thanks for that question. So he's asked, can you clarify how an OV can have oversight for salmon farms when in a truckload of salmon, the origin of the salmon might be from multiple farms across several producer nations?
Yeah, the key thing is the OV themselves may have oversight of the salmon farms, but doesn't have to. It's only a vet that needs to provide oversight of the farm. So if an OV is signing for a consignment of salmon which contains multiple origins, what we would expect that OV to have is an attestation from each of those salmon farms produced by a vet saying that they are providing the oversight. So absolutely, we wouldn't expect an OV to have oversight of multiple salmon farms. There's no need for that. We would just expect the vet to be providing oversight for each salmon farm and then provide an attestation to that OV.
Hopefully that helped. Colin, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just again, like particularly on frozen, when you might be pulling in products over quite a long period of time from large factories, the spread that they have in terms of where the geographies they're buying from is very wide, including Norwegian farms, potentially Faroese farms, Irish farms. I don't think it's in any way realistic that we're going to be able to get vet attestations particularly from abroad. Even in Scotland, that sounds to me extraordinarily challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you are pulling, it's probably worthwhile looking at what your journey maps are for your fish. Is it salmon that you're moving primarily, or is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what we would need so you're bringing salmon into the UK, into GB, and then freezing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not me that's bringing it in, it's the processing partners are bringing it in, processing it, and then the tends to be, you know, byproducts that are being frozen down over a period of time, and then exported, often,
Okay.
you know, around the world.
Yeah, so I think if you're leaving aside the rest of the world, we would need to look to see where your products are coming in from. If they're coming from the EU, then you might need a slightly different certificate. It might be the re-export one, but we will have to have a look and see how yours is working, because it's it's not necessarily straightforward where it's not a GB origin fish.
Yeah, but it would almost always not be the EU. I think it would only really be Norway. Norway is the main one, but also as I read the origin guidance is that if you're changing the product, it does become GB origin.
Yeah.
So I don't think the origin is the question. It's the how do you get a vet attestation, you know, when it's a lot of volume from a lot of different places.
It is, but there is part of the certificate which talks about where the actual fish comes from. So that is partly it, but I think what we'd need to do is look at how your OV can get that sort of assurance. But I think that might be something we need to pick up outside, because it's not going to be straightforward. Joe, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I would say I think what's likely going to be able to be used in this instance is the vet attestations are very much for domestically produced salmon. If it's imported, it will have. We may need to look at. It's not required yet, but the import kind of certificates will be needed in future when they're coming in to Great Britain, and we may need to look if that's the model to use that we're referring to. It's been cleared by the certifying officer in Norway, who's cleared that product to enter into Great Britain, and that's kind of the attestation that I may be able to use. But as Richard said, it's something that we have to just take offline and look at with a more detailed product journey, just to fully understand where everything's coming from, where it's going to, and over what time period.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Joe. So, Colin, yeah, we'll follow up with you on that. That's okay. And anyone that's got a sort of similar question, likewise, we'll do that. I know that Hannah has put some information on the sidebar, so please, everyone, look at that, because I think it's pretty helpful. Put a link and some explanations on there. Question from, I'll try and get through this. Lots of messages coming in now, and we don't have lots of time. So, question from Michelle Johnson: for the fish intended for human consumption in the EU, can it be a secondary label?
I think it can be a secondary label as long as it's attached to the container that it is that the fish are in. If that's, I think that's what they're meaning.
Yeah, and I think Hannah might have gone back on that as well. But thanks, Richard, and hopefully that helps Michelle answer your question. Question from Laura: can the new statements be added to the current label, i.e. destination, or does it need to be a separate label?
As far as I'm aware, it doesn't need to be a separate label. I think as long as it is labeled, that will be sufficient.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. So, question from Dale: if we sell head-on gutted salmon to a trader in the EU, we do not know where the final product will go and may get further processed. Are we okay to send these as fit for human consumption? And a follow-up question is: can our company vet sign the attestation? And another question is, do the vets have to be MRCVS certified to sign the attestation?
Okay, so our view is that if the product is ready for direct human consumption, without the need for further processing, and it goes to a fish market, then it can continue to be signed by an FCCO. If it is clearly going for further processing, then a vet will need to sign that. If you have any concerns, then we would say talk to the BCP, because they will be the receiving institution, and it will help sort of provide that clarity if you are concerned. Can your company vet sign the attestation? The attestation can, depends which attestation we're talking about here, but if we're talking about the attestation for veterinary oversight of an aquaculture site, then yes, provided there is not a conflict of interest. So what we would normally say is that the vet should not be solely employed by the company, that they should have alternative forms of employment. So it could be, for example, a local vet that comes in and provides veterinary oversight as well. Do the vets need to be MRCVS certified? Well, they need to be a MRCVS, yes. So they need to be a registered vet in the UK to be able to sign that attestation. They don't have to be an OV, provided it's not the clinical inspection, but they would need to be a fully registered UK vet, or UK vet that is approved to work in the UK, I should say.
Very much, Richard. Joe, did you want to come in on any of that? I think you've unmuted. So
I was going to follow up. Yeah, essentially just kind of clarify, if we're talking about a salmon farming business, if it is a vet employed solely by that salmon farmer and they're not contracting out to other businesses or doing other bits of work, then they probably would not be suitable for that attestation. If you're dealing with the veterinary fish specialists, which deal with a variety of salmon farmers, they would be kind of suitable for that role.
Absolutely, it's avoiding this conflict of interest.
Thanks both. Question in from Connie, saying thanks for your earlier answer. With regard to LBMs, in her case, razor clams, do they need an OV even though they are vector species?
Razor clams, I would need to check up on, to be honest. It isn't one I've looked at. So Joe, unless you've looked at this one, it isn't one
the only thing I'm thinking of is, are these razor clams which are landed by a fishing vessel? Because if they are, then they are exempt.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of razor clams are landed by fishing vessels. If they're hand collected, then it may need another thing.
Yes, I'm assuming they were hand collected, but yes, you're right.
If they're landed by a fishing vessel, then you're. If landed by a fishing vessel, then you're continue with the FCCO.
Thanks both. I think Connie, that's you saying yes, perfect, thanks. So that you might have answered the question in a perfect way. So that's helpful. Thank you. Gillian has followed up. Can you clarify what the destination food establishment number is? Is it per customer?
I think what they're meaning here is it is the legal recipient within the EU. So it is where the consignment is going. So it would be for the consignment.
Thank you, Richard. Hopefully that helps.
I think that's what that's meaning in this question.
Well, let us know, Gillian. I've just followed up. Okay, so the hub is that? Yeah.
So if it's the destination in the EU, it is going to a fish market. It would be that.
Thank you. And I think Hannah's come back to Gillian on that, and Gillian is saying okay, thanks. So that's good. We've only got a couple minutes left. I don't know if anyone else wants to ask questions at this stage. Just to say, I put my email address on the chat hub, and I'm probably going to be more of a coordinator than anything else on this. But please do email me, robbie.lansborough@seafoodscotland.org, if you've got follow-up things, or things didn't get answered quite to your satisfaction here, and I will be likely I'll just be passing on the questions, but please do that. So sort of let us know. And we've confirmed that the chat will be saved, so we can review the questions on the chat bar and follow up where it's needed. So anything that's been not quite resolved here, we will aim to get resolved as best we can. I think that, oh, sorry, we've got, no, sorry, Hannah, I think you're answering a question. So yeah, please do, everyone, keep paying attention to the tab and the chat bar, and hopefully that'll answer your questions. But for the purposes of the call, really appreciate everyone joining today. Thanks so much, Richard, Joe, and others on the panel for, well, thank you, Richard, for the presentation. Thanks, Hannah, for being really sort of diligent in answering questions on the chat bar. And thanks so much, Joe, and thanks to everyone to sort of help as best they can on these questions. And I think they've been pretty good at answering those questions. If I could possibly pass on to Steve to sort of summarize on all this, that'd be great. But just thanks to all of you for joining. Hopefully that helps, and a Merry Christmas to you all. Steve.
Hey, thanks, Robbie. No, thank you everyone for joining us today. And Richard for a very clear presentation. With these kinds of presentations, sometimes we have to go away and think about things, and then questions will come to mind. So it was just that Robbie's kindly put his contact details there, but just to remind you that Alistair and myself are always available for to be contacted if you